Ships vanished from my schedules before anyone admitted they were gone. I wrote the numbers as ordered, while my superiors asked for reassurance. The system told me the enemy was inefficient, yet the routes kept emptying. Each report weighed more than the last, and there was nowhere to place it. By early 1943, the Pacific War had entered its second full year. The initial phase of Japanese expansion had ended, and the conflict had settled into a prolonged struggle over distance, logistics, and endurance. Across the vast ocean spaces linking the Japanese home islands to Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific, shipping had become the decisive artery of the war. Fuel, food, ammunition, and raw materials moved almost entirely by sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood this in theory. In practice, its attention remained focused on surface engagements and fleet actions, while the protection of merchant shipping continued to receive secondary emphasis. In the spring of that year, Japanese merchant traffic flowed steadily from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies toward the home islands. Tankers carried crude oil and refined fuel northward through the South China Sea, the Luzon Strait, and the East China Sea. Freighters followed similar routes, carrying bauxite, rubber, rice, and military stores. Losses had occurred since late 1941, but they were considered manageable. Japanese naval assessments still described American submarines as inefficient and poorly handled. Reports from early encounters reinforced this belief. Many submarines were thought to have fired inaccurately or broken off attacks prematurely. The official view held that the American submarine force lacked discipline and experience. At the Yokosuka Naval District, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Masao, an officer assigned to convoy analysis and routing, spent much of his time reviewing routine shipping reports. Takahashi was not a senior figure. He had entered naval service before the war, trained in navigation and logistics, and was assigned administrative duties rather than combat command. His office received daily summaries listing departures, arrivals, delays, and losses. Most of the documents were repetitive, formatted to highlight tonnage delivered rather than risks encountered. Takahashi's workday followed a predictable pattern. Each morning, clerks delivered stacks of reports transmitted overnight from regional naval districts. The reports contained coordinates, dates, and brief descriptions of incidents. When ships failed to arrive, their absence was usually explained by weather delays or port congestion. Confirmed sinkings were listed separately, often with sparse detail. The tone of the paperwork was restrained, emphasizing continuity rather than disruption. In February 1943, Takahashi noticed a change that did not immediately attract broader attention. Several tankers assigned to the same route from Balikpapan to Moji arrived late or not at all. The explanations varied: mechanical issues, rerouting due to weather, or vague references to enemy submarine activity. None of these entries alone appeared significant. Combined, they suggested a pattern that was not yet formally acknowledged. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine at the time was shaped by pre-war assumptions. Submarines were regarded primarily as fleet scouts or commerce raiders of limited effectiveness. Defensive measures emphasized coastal patrols and occasional escort by small surface vessels. Sonar equipment, depth charge inventories, and convoy training lagged behind those of Allied navies. Escort vessels were often old destroyers or converted patrol craft with minimal coordination. Official assessments continued to state that American submarines suffered from defective torpedoes and inexperienced crews. This belief was not unfounded. In 1942, U.S. submarines had indeed struggled with unreliable torpedo detonators and depth-keeping problems. Many attacks failed despite correct positioning. Japanese commanders received reports of submarines firing multiple torpedoes with no visible result. These accounts reinforced confidence that the threat was limited. What Takahashi observed, however, was not a single dramatic incident, but a gradual accumulation of small discrepancies. Ships disappeared along routes that had previously been considered relatively safe. Loss reports increasingly cited attacks at night or in poor visibility, conditions once thought to favor the defender. Escort commanders reported difficulty detecting submarines before torpedoes struck. In one case from March 1943, a medium tanker was listed as presumed sunk after failing to arrive at its destination. The escort report stated that no torpedo tracks were seen and no submarine was detected on sonar. The explanation suggested a mine or mechanical failure, yet no minefields were known in that area, and similar incidents had occurred nearby within weeks. Takahashi began marking these entries in his personal working notebook. He did not alter official summaries, nor did he circulate independent conclusions. His role was observational, not analytical at a strategic level. Still, he started comparing dates and locations across reports. The distances between incidents were often too small to be coincidental. Routes overlapped in ways that suggested deliberate patrol patterns rather than random encounters. Within the Japanese naval bureaucracy, such observations rarely moved quickly. Information flowed upward through multiple layers of command, each responsible for filtering and consolidating data. Reports emphasizing losses risked appearing alarmist or defeatist. The prevailing expectation was that American submarine performance would remain inconsistent. Improvements, if they occurred, were assumed to be slow. At sea, Japanese escort crews followed established routines. Convoys were often small, sometimes consisting of only 2 or 3 merchant ships with a single escort. Zigzag patterns were irregular, and radio silence limited communication between vessels. Many escorts lacked modern sonar or had crews insufficiently trained to interpret its readings. Depth charges were used sparingly, often after an attack rather than as a preventive measure. American submarines, meanwhile, were operating under evolving orders. By early 1943, patrol areas were being reassigned based on shipping intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. Crews were gaining experience, and tactical doctrine emphasized coordinated attacks and improved fire control solutions. These changes were not immediately visible to Japanese observers. What they noticed instead were the results: missing ships, delayed cargoes, and unexplained sinkings. In April, Takahashi attended a routine briefing where senior officers reviewed shipping statistics for the previous quarter. The tone remained cautiously optimistic. Losses were acknowledged, but described as acceptable. Emphasis was placed on the continued flow of oil and raw materials. The briefing materials compared current losses favorably to those suffered by Germany in the Atlantic, enforcing the idea that Japan's situation was under control. After the briefing, Takahashi returned to his office and reviewed the latest convoy arrival data. Another tanker had failed to report in. The loss was provisionally attributed to mechanical failure. No escort report accompanied the entry. Takahashi added the ship's name to his notebook and noted the approximate location where contact had been lost. By late April, the notebook contained several pages of similar entries. Individually, none contradicted official assessments. Together, they suggested that American submarines were operating with increasing precision. Attacks were occurring farther from the coast, along predictable shipping lanes. Escorts reported fewer sightings and sudden strikes. Takahashi was careful not to draw conclusions beyond what the data allowed. He did not claim certainty, nor did he challenge doctrine directly. His observations remained confined to his personal notes and quiet discussions with a few colleagues in logistics and convoy planning. Some shared his unease, others dismissed it as coincidence. At this stage, Japanese commanders still believed they understood the submarine threat. Official communications continued to describe American submarines as dangerous but inefficient, capable of occasional success, but unlikely to disrupt Japan's maritime lifelines in a sustained way. The losses recorded so far did not yet threaten overall supply levels. As April turned to May, convoy schedules remained unchanged. Routes were adjusted only minimally. Escort assignments followed established patterns. The administrative machinery of the Navy continued its routines, confident that existing measures were sufficient. For Takahashi, the work remained the same, reviewing reports, marking discrepancies, and observing trends that were not yet acknowledged in formal doctrine. The operational situation appeared stable on paper, even as small signs of strain accumulated quietly within the records. By May 1943, the volume of Japanese merchant traffic had not diminished, but the margins of safety within which it operated were narrowing. Tankers and freighters continued to depart on schedule, yet arrival intervals grew less predictable. Loss reports, once isolated, appeared with increasing regularity. The Imperial Japanese Navy acknowledged these developments internally, but its interpretation remained framed by existing doctrine. Submarine attacks were treated as episodic hazards rather than as components of a coordinated campaign. At Yokosuka, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Masao saw his workload expand. The number of reports requiring clarification increased, particularly those involving ships that failed to reach port without a confirmed cause. Regional commands often delayed classification of losses, preferring to wait for survivors, wreckage, or intercepted enemy signals. In many cases, no such confirmation arrived. Vessels simply vanished from schedules, their cargoes unaccounted for. Takahashi's responsibility included compiling monthly summaries that were forwarded to higher staff sections. These documents emphasized totals: tonnage delivered, tonnage lost, days delayed. The format left little room for pattern analysis. Nonetheless, Takahashi began attaching supplementary notes, phrased cautiously, suggesting that certain routes were experiencing a higher frequency of incidents. The language was neutral, framed as a request for review rather than an assertion of error. Responses to these notes were limited. Some were acknowledged without comment, others were returned with marginal annotations indicating that losses remained within expected parameters. The prevailing view held that American submarines still lacked the technical reliability to sustain pressure. Reports from escort commanders describing failed torpedo detonations continued to circulate, reinforcing confidence that the enemy's difficulties persisted. At sea, however, escort crews reported growing frustration. In the South China Sea, several convoys came under attack without prior warning. Torpedoes struck ships traveling in daylight, sometimes from unexpected angles. Escorts responded with depth charges, but sonar contacts were fleeting or non-existent. After-action reports often concluded that the submarine had escaped undamaged. One incident in mid-May involved a convoy of 3 freighters escorted by a single patrol vessel. 2 ships were hit within minutes of each other. The escort dropped depth charges based on estimated bearings, expending much of its limited supply. No debris or oil slick was observed. The surviving freighter proceeded alone to port. The escort commander reported that the attack demonstrated improved enemy firing accuracy, a phrase that appeared more frequently in reports as the month progressed. Japanese naval staff compared these incidents with earlier encounters from 1942. The contrast was noticeable. Previously, submarines often fired from long range or exposed periscopes during approach. Now, attacks appeared closer and more controlled. Torpedoes struck amidships rather than at the bow or stern. The timing suggested careful fire control rather than opportunistic firing. Despite these indications, doctrinal assumptions remained largely unchanged. Anti-submarine warfare training continued to emphasize individual ship actions rather than coordinated convoy defense. Escort vessels rarely practiced mutual support or layered screening. Communications procedures discouraged frequent radio transmissions, limiting real-time coordination during attacks. Within staff discussions, losses were sometimes attributed to temporary enemy concentration. It was argued that American submarines, constrained by numbers, could only focus on limited areas at a time. Once patrols shifted elsewhere, shipping would resume with fewer interruptions. This reasoning supported the decision to maintain existing routes and schedules. Takahashi noted that this assumption conflicted with the data he was seeing. Attacks were occurring across multiple regions simultaneously. The geographic spread suggested that more submarines were operational, or that those already deployed were being used more effectively. His notes began to include references to overlapping patrol zones inferred from attack timings and locations. In June, a significant convoy carrying oil from Palembang experienced multiple losses over the course of 2 weeks. Escorts reported at least 3 separate submarine contacts along the same route. Each incident was treated independently in official records. No comprehensive review was initiated. The oil shipments continued, though with increased delays. At a mid-year review meeting, senior officers acknowledged that losses were trending upward. Charts presented comparative figures, showing a gradual increase month by month. The explanation offered emphasized enemy persistence rather than enemy improvement. The conclusion was that existing countermeasures needed to be applied more consistently, not fundamentally revised. Some officers privately questioned this conclusion. Escort commanders returning from sea described an adversary that appeared increasingly confident. Submarines remained on station after attacks, sometimes attempting follow-up shots. Such behavior contrasted with earlier caution, when American boats often disengaged after a single firing opportunity. Takahashi's position did not allow him to challenge strategic decisions directly. However, he continued refining his internal analyses. He cross-referenced loss reports with convoy compositions and escort types. Convoys with minimal escort coverage appeared disproportionately affected. Routes lacking air patrol support showed similar vulnerability. He shared these observations informally with a colleague assigned to training and readiness. The colleague acknowledged the patterns, but noted that resources were limited. New escort construction lagged behind demand. Aircraft suitable for anti-submarine patrol were prioritized for other missions. Doctrinal revisions required approval at levels far above their authority. By late June, the language in reports subtly shifted. Phrases such as enemy submarine skill and effective tactics appeared more frequently, though still without emphasis. These descriptors coexisted uneasily with official statements asserting that the overall situation remained manageable. Japanese commanders continued to believe that American submarines faced inherent limitations, limited endurance, mechanical unreliability, and insufficient coordination. The possibility that these limitations were being overcome was discussed, but not formally incorporated into planning assumptions. As summer approached, the cumulative effect of losses began to strain scheduling. Tankers arrived with reduced cargoes due to damage. Some ships required repairs before unloading. Port congestion increased, further complicating logistics. Each disruption was addressed individually without a comprehensive reassessment of the underlying cause. For Takahashi, the growing disparity between recorded data and official interpretation became harder to ignore. His notebook now contained entries spanning several months, documenting a steady progression from sporadic incidents to sustained pressure. Yet within the system, these observations remained peripheral. The operational problem was no longer confined to isolated sinkings. It was becoming systemic, though not yet openly acknowledged as such. Japanese naval doctrine, shaped by earlier expectations, struggled to account for an enemy that appeared to be learning and adapting faster than anticipated. By late summer 1943, the discrepancy between Japanese expectations and operational reality could no longer be confined to informal notes or marginal comments. Shipping losses had reached levels that required explanation beyond routine variance. Fuel deliveries to the home islands were increasingly irregular, and reserve stocks began to fluctuate in ways that planners found difficult to smooth through scheduling alone. The American submarine threat, once described as persistent but limited, was forcing adjustments that Doctrine had not anticipated. Within the Yokosuka Naval District, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Masao's role expanded subtly. He was asked to assist in a temporary review group tasked with reconciling convoy delays across multiple regions. The group was not formed to question doctrine, but to identify administrative bottlenecks. Nevertheless, it brought together officers from routing, training, and escort coordination, allowing comparisons that rarely occurred in routine reporting. As data from the first half of 1943 were consolidated, certain patterns became unavoidable. Losses were no longer concentrated near major ports or choke points alone. They extended along open ocean stretches previously considered relatively safe. American submarines were striking ships shortly after departure and again near destination waters, indicating sustained tracking rather than chance encounters. Escort reports increasingly referenced torpedo spreads rather than single impacts. This suggested that submarines were firing multiple weapons in controlled sequences, adjusting aim based on observed results. Such tactics required confidence in fire control systems and crew coordination. These were not characteristics previously attributed to American submarine operations. The review group examined a series of attacks in the East China Sea. In several cases, submarines had penetrated convoy screens and achieved hits despite evasive maneuvers. Escorts reported that depth-charge counterattacks produced no confirmed results. In one instance, an escort vessel believed it had damaged a submarine only for another attack to occur hours later along the same route. This accumulation of evidence forced a limited reassessment. The question was no longer whether American submarines posed a threat, but how that threat was being underestimated. Takahashi prepared a short internal memorandum summarizing observed trends. He avoided speculative language, focusing instead on measurable changes: increased hit rates, repeated contact within the same patrol zones, and attacks coordinated with shipping schedules. The memorandum did not circulate widely. It was forwarded through official channels and acknowledged by a superior officer, who noted that the findings were of interest. No immediate action followed. Still, the act of documenting these observations marked a shift from passive recording to cautious analysis. At sea, the consequences of underestimation became more tangible. Convoys began sailing with fewer ships to reduce losses per voyage, a practice that increased total transit time and strained escort availability. Smaller convoys were more vulnerable, but the alternative, large, slow-moving formations, was considered impractical given limited escort resources. Japanese anti-submarine training exercises continued, but their scope remained constrained. Crews practiced sonar operation and depth charge deployment under controlled conditions. These drills did not replicate the complexity of real engagements, where submarines attacked from unexpected bearings and depths. After-action reports from exercises showed improvement, yet combat reports told a different story. American submarine operations, though not fully understood by Japanese planners, were benefiting from accumulated experience. Patrol reports intercepted later in the war would reveal systematic changes in approach and engagement criteria. At the time, Japanese observers inferred improvement indirectly through the increasing consistency of attacks. One particularly instructive incident occurred in August 1943, involving a convoy bound for Kyushu. The convoy was attacked twice within a single night by what escorts believed to be two separate submarines. Both attacks were executed without detection prior to torpedo impact. The escort commander concluded that enemy submarines were operating with patience and precision, a notable departure from earlier descriptions. This report reached Takahashi's desk within days. He added it to his growing collection of examples indicating that American submarines were no longer disengaging after initial attacks. Instead, they were maintaining contact, repositioning, and striking again when conditions allowed. Within the review group, discussion turned to whether existing routing assumptions were valid. Shipping lanes had been designed based on pre-war intelligence and early war experience. They emphasized efficiency over unpredictability. Deviating from these routes would increase transit times and fuel consumption, both already under pressure. Takahashi suggested a limited experiment, altering routes slightly for select convoys to test whether losses decreased. The proposal was framed as a logistical adjustment rather than a doctrinal change. It was approved for a small number of sailings, largely because it did not require additional resources. The results were inconclusive. Some altered routes experienced fewer incidents, while others encountered submarines regardless. The ambiguity reinforced hesitation at higher levels. Without clear evidence that changes would produce immediate improvement, commanders were reluctant to disrupt established systems. As summer turned to autumn, the human cost of the situation became more visible. Merchant crews faced repeated voyages through contested waters. Survivors of sinkings reported sudden impacts without warning, followed by rapid abandonment. These accounts circulated informally, but rarely influenced planning discussions, which prioritized aggregate figures over individual experiences. For Takahashi, the turning point was not a single event, but the realization that the pattern he had been observing was no longer marginal. American submarines were demonstrating an ability to adapt faster than Japanese countermeasures. The gap between doctrine and reality was widening. Yet acknowledging this gap carried risk. Questioning established assessments could be interpreted as criticism of senior command. Takahashi chose a cautious approach, continuing to document evidence while avoiding overt challenges. His position remained administrative, but the implications of his observations were increasingly strategic. By September 1943, shipping losses had begun to affect industrial output forecasts. Fuel rationing measures were discussed in planning circles, though not publicly announced. These discussions implicitly recognized that maritime supply lines were under sustained pressure. The Imperial Japanese Navy still believed it could manage the situation through incremental improvements. Additional escorts were assigned where possible. Air patrol coverage was modestly increased near key routes. These measures acknowledged a problem without conceding a fundamental misjudgment. For Takahashi, the risk became personal in a professional sense. His analyses now touched on core assumptions of naval planning. Continuing to observe without speaking risked irrelevance. Speaking too openly risked isolation within the bureaucracy. As autumn progressed, American submarines continued to operate with growing effectiveness. The evidence accumulated quietly in reports and summaries, awaiting a response that Doctrine had not provided. By the final months of 1943, the consequences of earlier assumptions were no longer confined to administrative records. They manifested in measurable strain across Japan's maritime system. Fuel deliveries fluctuated sharply. Some industrial centers received less oil than projected, forcing adjustments in production schedules. The Navy's operational planners attributed these disruptions to a combination of enemy pressure and unavoidable wartime conditions, but the distinction between the two was becoming difficult to maintain. Within the Convoy Review Group, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Masao's role remained unofficial but persistent. He was now consulted informally by officers preparing briefings for higher command. His notebooks, once private, were occasionally referenced to confirm dates or locations. This shift did not elevate his status, but it placed his observations closer to decision-making processes than before. As losses mounted, pressure from senior command moved in two directions simultaneously. On one hand, there was demand for reassurance that countermeasures were effective and that the situation remained under control. On the other, there was an unspoken recognition that existing explanations were insufficient. These conflicting pressures shaped how information was presented upward. Anti-submarine measures were expanded incrementally. Additional patrol craft were reassigned to escort duty, reducing availability elsewhere. Some destroyers previously reserved for fleet operations were diverted to convoy protection. Training syllabi were updated to emphasize rapid response and sustained pursuit, though the material lagged behind observed enemy tactics. Despite these changes, American submarines continued to achieve results. In October, several large tankers were lost in rapid succession along routes that had recently been reinforced. Escorts reported that submarines attacked from outside expected approach sectors. Torpedo tracks were observed crossing convoy paths at oblique angles, complicating evasive maneuvers. These incidents challenged the assumption that losses could be reduced simply by adding escorts. The problem appeared to involve not only numbers but coordination and anticipation. Submarines seemed to know where convoys would be, arriving in position ahead of time. This implied effective intelligence or predictable routing, or both. Takahashi raised this point cautiously during an internal discussion. He noted that convoy schedules, though classified, followed regular patterns driven by port capacity and cargo priorities. Repetition, he suggested, might be aiding enemy prediction. The comment was recorded without objection but not pursued further. Altering schedules would require extensive coordination across multiple commands, a task considered impractical under current conditions. As winter approached, the stakes became more explicit. Fuel shortages threatened naval training cycles. Air units reported reduced flight hours. Civilian shipping allocations were tightened, affecting domestic distribution. Each of these effects traced back, indirectly, to losses at sea. Pushback emerged within the system. Some officers argued that focusing too heavily on submarine threats risked diverting resources from decisive fleet actions. They maintained that American submarines, regardless of recent successes, could not determine the outcome of the war. This perspective aligned with long-held doctrinal priorities and found support among senior figures. Others, particularly those involved in logistics and escort operations, expressed growing concern. Their reports emphasized cumulative impact rather than individual incidents. Tonnage lost over time mattered more than isolated sinkings. These arguments gained limited traction but did not yet reshape policy. For Takahashi, this period marked the peak of professional tension. His analyses now intersected directly with contested interpretations. He was careful to frame his contributions as descriptive rather than prescriptive. Even so, the implications were clear. American submarines were no longer an intermittent nuisance. They were exerting sustained pressure on Japan's ability to move essential resources. In November 1943, a senior staff officer requested a consolidated briefing on submarine-related losses over the past year. Takahashi assisted in preparing the material. The charts showed a steady upward trend in both sinkings and damaged tonnage. The presentation avoided attributing cause beyond enemy improvement, but the visual evidence spoke plainly. The briefing concluded without immediate directives. It was followed by a closed discussion among senior officers, the content of which did not circulate widely. Subsequent orders reflected continuity rather than change. Convoys continued to sail, escorts continued their routines. Incremental adjustments persisted. At sea, merchant crews faced the reality of these decisions. Survivors' reports described submarines attacking with increasing boldness, sometimes surfacing briefly to assess damage before submerging again. Such behavior suggested confidence that escorts could not respond effectively. By December, the operational strain reached a point where further denial became difficult. Losses in critical cargo categories prompted emergency redistribution measures. Some planned operations were delayed due to fuel constraints. These outcomes were acknowledged internally as symptoms of a larger problem. The system, however, remained resistant to admitting fundamental error. To do so would require revisiting assumptions embedded in years of planning and training. For many commanders, such an admission carried implications beyond immediate logistics. Takahashi's role remained that of an observer and recorder, yet his work now carried weight beyond routine administration. The stakes had risen. The gap between doctrine and reality had become a liability, and the cost of delay was measured in ships, cargoes, and operational flexibility. As 1943 drew to a close, American submarines continued their patrols with increasing effectiveness. The Japanese response, constrained by doctrine and resources, struggled to keep pace. The moment approached when incremental adjustments would no longer suffice, and a more explicit reckoning would be required.
In early 1944, the cumulative impact of the previous year's shipping losses forced a change in how the Imperial Japanese Navy discussed the submarine threat, if not how it publicly framed it. Internal planning documents began to reference fuel scarcity as a structural constraint rather than a temporary disruption. Allocations for training, transport, and fleet movement were revised downward. These adjustments did not single out American submarines as the sole cause, but their influence was implicit. At Yokosuka, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Masao continued his work without promotion or reassignment. His temporary role in the Convoy Review Group ended as quietly as it had begun. The group's findings were absorbed into broader staff assessments, stripped of individual attribution. Takahashi returned to routine duties, compiling reports that now reflected a more cautious tone across the system. That shift in tone marked an institutional change. Official language no longer described American submarines as inefficient or unreliable. Instead, reports referred to them as persistent and well-coordinated. The acknowledgement came without formal announcement, embedded in phrasing rather than policy declarations. Doctrine, on paper, remained largely intact, but expectations adjusted. Concrete measures followed, though later than Takahashi and others had quietly hoped. Convoy sizes were standardized to allow more consistent escort coverage. Zigzag patterns were revised and enforced more rigorously. Air patrol coordination improved modestly in key areas, though aircraft shortages limited effectiveness. Escort commanders received updated guidance emphasizing anticipation rather than reaction. These changes slowed losses in some regions but did not reverse the overall trend. By mid-1944, American submarine operations had expanded further, supported by improved intelligence, radar, and torpedo reliability. Japanese countermeasures, constrained by material shortages and training limitations, struggled to match this pace. The consequences extended beyond the Navy. Industrial planners faced ongoing uncertainty in raw material deliveries. Fuel rationing deepened. Civilian transportation suffered as shipping was diverted or delayed. Each of these effects traced back to decisions made when the submarine threat had been underestimated. Within naval staff circles, retrospective assessments began to circulate. These documents examined early war assumptions about submarine warfare and acknowledged that they had not accounted for an enemy capable of rapid adaptation. The analysis was analytical rather than accusatory. Responsibility was framed as collective, rooted in pre-war doctrine rather than individual failure. Takahashi contributed to one such assessment indirectly, providing data tables and historical summaries. His role remained anonymous. The analysis noted that early reports dismissing American submarine effectiveness delayed necessary adjustments. It stopped short of identifying specific officers or departments. The focus was on lessons rather than blame. As the war progressed, these lessons informed limited reforms, though circumstances prevented their full implementation. Escort production increased, but not fast enough. Training programs incorporated more realistic scenarios, but experienced crews were scarce. The system adapted, but under pressure and with diminishing resources. For Takahashi, the end of the war brought no public recognition of his observations. Like many staff officers, he was demobilized and returned to civilian life. His wartime notebooks, preserved among personal papers, recorded months of careful observation and restrained analysis. They offered a quiet record of how change was perceived before it was acknowledged. In post-war years, historians examining Japanese shipping losses identified 1943 as a critical period. It was the year when American submarines transitioned from inconsistent attackers to a sustained force capable of disrupting Japan's maritime lifelines. This transition did not occur overnight. It emerged through accumulated experience, technical correction, and tactical refinement. Japanese commanders, conditioned by earlier encounters and doctrinal assumptions, struggled to recognize this shift in time to counter it effectively. The learning curve on one side outpaced adaptation on the other. The result was not a single decisive moment, but a gradual erosion of capacity. Takahashi's experience illustrated how such erosion became visible first in routine data rather than dramatic events. Shipping schedules, delay reports, and loss summaries revealed patterns long before official doctrine adjusted. His work showed that recognition of change often begins at the margins, among those tasked with recording rather than commanding. The legacy of this period lies not in a dramatic reversal, but in the accumulation of small decisions and delayed acknowledgments. American submarines did not become effective because Japanese commanders failed entirely, but because adaptation occurred unevenly. One side learned faster, and the other held to assumptions longer than circumstances allowed. Today, the story of the Pacific submarine campaign is often told through statistics and tonnage figures. Behind those numbers were individuals like Takahashi, whose quiet observations reflected a system under strain. Their experiences remind us that wars are shaped as much by perception and interpretation as by firepower. If you value historically grounded stories that focus on overlooked individuals and the quieter mechanisms of war, consider supporting the channel so more of these accounts can be explored.